Test, 1, 2, 3. Right. Jesus. The Magnus Archives definitely took over my life for the past 3 years, and I want to go into a deep dive into the podcast and talk about some of the themes and some of the characters in those stories to try and get a gist of the whole encompass of that kind of project, and to also talk about some of the themes surrounding gay representation, like the tropes of killing your gays and those sorts of things in that podcast setting, to try and see whether or not overall whether the podcast is something you should listen to, which I think personally is a good listen, but whether or not it's suitable for all kind of representations of people, and really giving it a deep dive and seeing if it's worth even listening to. The Magnus Archives is a weekly horror podcast that was written by Jonathan Sims, or Johnny Sims, and Alexander J. Newell. It was released by Rusty Quill, and it's a very good podcast in my opinion. But yeah, it has ended now. It ended in 2021, but it did amass quite a following in the times from when it started up until 2021. It was quite popular and also gained many awards. There are 5 seasons and 200 episodes, so you get quite a lot out of what you're listening to, and if you had listened to it while it was coming out, you would have had a lot of content over a year, like space time, and, you know, a lot happens in those seasons. A lot happens in the episodes. It's kind of difficult to try and keep up with those sorts of things, but if you continue listening to it, you will get the gist of what's going on. The podcast follows Jonathan Sims, the archivist, not to be confused with Jonathan Sims, who is also the writer. So when I say John, I will be talking about the archivist. When I'm talking about Johnny, I'll be talking about the writer. Just so there's no confusion in that. And also I won't be calling Alex Alexander J. Newell, I'll just be calling him Alex. So as I said, John started in the Institute as head archivist after the previous head archivist, Gertrude Robinson, had died. So he's now taking over that role and filling in for Gertrude. We follow loads of different statements, and those statements are from people from the general public who have come in and given their account of what has happened in their life, and those are based on fears that are in our day-to-day world. I'll go into more about what those fears are in a moment, but if we get the gist of what it's kind of about, then I'll go into the fears. So as we progress through the story, we get loads of different statements from people who come and sell their statement or give their statement to the Magnus Institute. The Magnus Institute is in London. It's a UK-based kind of podcast. However, they do go to places like America to get statements and things like that. Something that's freaky about this podcast is that Johnny himself had said that he specifically created these statements and the locations in these statements to freak people out if they knew that they were, like, if those statements were near where they lived, or if they knew the locations of where they were, which is quite freaky. I know for myself there are a few episodes of, like, in the place that I live, which is terrifying to me. It's a lot.
Burke County got a reference near the end of episode 58, Trail Rations. They were very happy by that.
Yes.
Is there any method that you use to choosing locations mentioned in the show?
Right, what I will do is I will figure out the rough geographical area, like the country or the sort of the area of the US, if it's set there. And then I will go to Google Maps and I will zoom in to a level that I think people will find creepy if they're there and it gets referenced. And they'll be like, why has he referenced this place specifically? And there's no particular reason, but I really like being super specific deliberately to just slightly worry people.
So as I had mentioned before, these statements are given by people who talk about fears, and these fears are entities in our world. You can either call them fears or you can call them entities, and their avatars, which are the people who are controlled or being used to gain power for these almighty entities or fears. Now, Smirk listed 14 of these fears as follows. The buried, which is claustrophobia, the fear of being, in a tight space, not being able to escape. The corruption, which is filth, disease, disgust, usually is in the form of like worms and insects. Not to be confused with spiders, though. That's another fear. The dark, which is the fear of the dark. The desolation, which is fear of senseless violence, usually manifested in fire. The end, which is the fear of death. The eye, the fear of being watched, or, having knowledge known about you that you don't want other people to know. The flesh is pretty self-explanatory. The flesh being, the fear of being used as just meat, and you as a person just being a bag of meat and bones. The hunt, which is an animalistic fear of being chased, being hunted down, those sorts of things. The lonely, isolation, the fear of being alone. The slaughter, that's another kind of senseless violence one, but usually is linked to war. The spiral, the fear of madness. The stranger, the fear of the unknown, uncanny valley sort of thing. People not really being quite there. The vast open spaces, the fear of falling, vertigo, thalassophobia, that sort of thing, like the fear of open water and stuff like that. And the web, which is the fear of spiders, the fear of being controlled, or your will not being your own, that sort of thing. And then there is the added addition of the extinction as well, which is one of the fears that had just come into fruition, or something that they were terrified of that would come into fruition if they didn't do any of the rituals. Obviously, these fears manifest in different ways. Like the web can be puppets, but it could also be spiders, that sort of thing. Like, there are a few different avatars of those fears that kind of work in different ways to other avatars in that fear category, which is something that's quite cool, and something I like. There are many themes in the Magnus Archives, like the theme of death, which is quite heavy. Obviously, there's a massive theme around fear and, terror, and these fears basically coming to get you. However, in a horror podcast, there is also the theme of love and relationships and difficulties in relationships, which we see a lot in this show. Throughout most of the seasons, we do see, especially in the beginning season, we see John and Martin's relationship not being a good one. John isn't very interested in Martin. Martin seems interested in John, but it doesn't look like it will go anywhere. However, as we progress through the stories, they do happen to get into a relationship, and it's a lovely relationship. I do love it. And it's good to see some good gay representation, also some good asexual representation in John's case, as we find out in one of the seasons that John is asexual, which is fun.
That boy needs to relax.
Or at least find someone else to fuss over.
Yeah, he's got it bad. Do you know if he and John ever...
No clue, and not interested. Although, according to Georgie, John doesn't. Like, at all.
Huh. Yeah, that does explain some stuff.
There is a lot of gay representation in the Magnus Archives. We have Tim, who is our canon bisexual. I love Tim. There is the headcanon of Elias Bouchard and Peter Lucas, Elias being an avatar of the Eye, and Peter Lucas being an avatar of the Lonely, which they contrast. The two entities contrast very much. However, gotta love some good representation. Even if it's not real, but I would like to say it's real, okay? Then we have John and Martin, we have Daisy and Basira, who is, they're kind of... I don't know if they are in a relationship, but I would say they have that close bond, which makes it seem like they are in a relationship. And I would say that's kind of a lesbian pairing, which once again, lovely. I will say, though, that there is the... and it's, you know, you can't really do much about it, because if most of the characters are in somewhat LGBT, you will have, especially in a horror podcast, you're leaning into the trope of killing your gays if you're killing a lot of your characters, and those characters are gay or they're part of the LGBT community. That then is a worry that most of your characters, if you kill them off, you're then killing a large majority of those characters who are gay. I don't know whether that's such a big thing in the podcast, because, as I said, if most of your characters are part of the LGBT community and you're killing any range of character you like, you're kind of not even going near that trope, which is alright. It's, you know, you can't really avoid those sorts of tropes, especially if, you know, you have gay characters and they happen to die. You know, the fans of the show will then be like, oh, you're killing your gays. But if you have a lot of gay characters and, you know, you can't really do anything about that, then fair enough. One of my favourite characters in this show is Oliver Banks, who is an avatar of the end being the entity of, you know, having the fear of death. Mainly because his whole thing is that he never wanted to be a part of it. He didn't even have an interest in it, and he just happened to be an avatar because that's what happened, and he became that way, and he didn't really antagonise anyone because of it. He actually helped John, which is something that was shocking to see from an avatar of a fear of death, considering that he helped John while he was in a coma. So you would think, oh yeah, we'll get the fear of death. No, he just helped him because why not? Another one of my favourite avatars, or my favourite characters, is Elias Bouchard. Elias, he's a horrible man, but he is amazing at the same time. He is the sort of, you know, boss, leader guy who is obviously an avatar of the eye, so he knows everything. He's all powerful, and at the end of season 5, you know, he basically becomes a god. So, and I do love the connotation of him kind of being in a divorced, then back again, divorced, then back again kind of relationship with Peter Lucas, as Peter runs and funds the institute, and therefore his funding is put into Elias's pocket to then, you know, continue with the institute doing what it does. And I love the connotation of those two being in a relationship, or having an on and off relationship in headcanon. It's something I like a lot. There is this theme throughout, though, of this... John is taking, you know, all of these fears in, and he's starting to have a problem with addiction. And there is that underlying theme of addiction in the podcast itself, where John has to have statements, and if he doesn't, then he gets withdrawals, and he gets, you know, worn down, and he can't use his power to the fullest potential, which it's a dangerous slope to go down when you're talking about addiction in that sort of way. And you also see it with Daisy's character as well. She's kind of weaned herself off of this drive that she has, but when it comes back and she's introduced to it again, it takes over her and she can't stop it anymore. Those sorts of themes are very deep and very strong, strongly embedded into that storyline, and when you see them two together and they talk, it's, you know, it's like they're in a... It's one of those kind of things when two people who are addicted to something talk, and you get the outcome of it being like, I've struggled with this, you struggle with it too, let's talk about it. And, you know, they do it in a very sensitive way, and they don't outright say it's something about addiction, but obviously there are a lot of underlying themes of it. But I think overall they do work around it very well. And they also talk about that sort of thing in a detailed way without it being offensive or without it being triggering. And especially, you know, when it comes along with other themes in the show about death, and addiction and other things like that, where you can't stop the inevitable of it happening. Those themes are handled very well in the show. And you also get trigger warnings if you want to avoid certain episodes like that, which I like a lot. Magnus Archives as a whole, though, is a very good representation of many different parts and many different facets of life, even if it's a sort of fictional thing that you think, oh, that could never happen. Those sorts of things are also embedded into the real life world, where you get location based things, you get things that do actually happen in the real world, and things like with mental health. There is an episode in season 5 talking about mental health, and it's a very difficult episode to listen to, especially if you've dealt with having a bad mental health, or dealt with therapists who have not been so nice, or dealt with a corrupt system of the healthcare system where it hasn't worked out in your favour. Those sorts of things are difficult to listen to, and you might struggle listening to them. But with the themes that they talk about, they do seem to, in my opinion, closely resemble the truth as much as possible. For example, also in season 5, they talked about police brutality and the difficult themes within that, which I think was something that they did very well, and especially were very sensitive on that topic to not make it offensive. Along the same lines as that, there are many characters who have those themes of mental illness, and also, encompass that sort of thing of like, I'm struggling and I need help, but I can't reach out for help, or the complete opposite of I need help and I'm going to therapy, which we have the two ends of that being Jonathan Sims, or John Sims, the archivist, and Melanie, who, it's the complete two opposites. Melanie went to go to therapy to talk about what's happened to her while joining the Institute, and John basically didn't tell anyone his problems until he got together with Martin. John...
What was that? Okay, James.
This man had no, self-esteem, no self-worth, and only told someone that there was an issue when that issue then became a worldwide issue altogether. Which you could say also led to the apocalypse, because he kind of didn't tell anyone that he was struggling, and then Elias kind of took advantage of that. Yeah. John's really dumb. As an avatar of the eye, John is a very decent, and I would say it's kind of freaky how he goes from season 1 to season 5 being a complete, he wasn't great. Okay, he was kind of horrible in season 1 to season 5, where he's this completely different character. He's also near a god level of power, and could rival the levels of Elias, who also has that similar kind of power. In a world where everything is destroyed, the fears have taken over the world, and he can't really do much to fix it, you get an alright outcome by the end of season 5. Now, I know that the end of season 5 kind of irritated a lot of people, as it left in a kind of ambiguous way of Martin and John were in this predicament. John basically had to destroy himself in order to turn the world back to what it was before. Martin didn't want that, and it kind of ended up going, John and Martin have either died or they're transported to somewhere else. You don't really know what's happened to them, but you end up with all the other characters who are still alive, kind of picking up the pieces of that world where the fears have kind of dissipated and things have kind of returned back to normal. Which, I like the ending. It was just, where could you go from there? Obviously, because they ended it, it was the sort of thing of like, well, they're not going to go anywhere from that. And lo and behold, another podcast gets announced. the Magnus Archives 2 or the Magnus Protocol, which, great title, love it. If you watch their like live, they did like a live stream where they talked about the new podcast. There are a lot of similar things. There are a lot of things that are completely different. So I would say, like, if you like the Magnus Archives, the Magnus Protocol probably would interest you. But who knows? It's not out yet, so I can't recommend you this other podcast without even listening to it myself, because I might not even like it. I will say though that Johnny and Alex both did an amazing job of creating this podcast and making it so that people are invested in it, and it's an amazing podcast. What can I say? It's very good, and the themes and the storylines in it are something that I can't compare to anything else. In the horror medium, and I will say that I'm a big fan of horror films, I'm a big fan of anything to do with horror. Having a horror podcast to listen to is something that excites me and is something that's fun. And listening to that when I listened to it like every day when I was trying to catch up with it, I liked it a lot. But yeah, that was the Magnus Archives. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Comment below if you want me to talk about any other podcast, if you want me to listen to another podcast, if you want me to talk about any TV shows or films that might interest you or that I've watched where I can go into detail about it or anything like that. Give me a little comment. And yeah, that's been the Magnus Archives. It's been a wild ride. It ended in 2021 and I was very sad about it. But yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.